Japanese tanks are being used in the Ukrainian conflict. The Ukrainian armed forces took the initiative to prepare an entirely new operation. During the attack, Russian troops were at a loss for what to do. Russian T-90s were destroyed. With this assistance, Japan significantly altered the direction of the war. However, Putin's actions threw the world into disarray. In the latter days of the Russian-Ukrainian War, the Ukrainian army began to reap considerable rewards. As a result, support for Ukraine has taken on a new appearance. The Ukrainian army began to stand out due to the incredible pace with which it modernized. Western activities in this area are particularly reprehensible, as they assisted Ukraine in reaching a new level of strength. Nonetheless, this increased Japanese backing has thrown everything into the mix. Unlike defensive armaments, the Ukrainian military has recently purchased more offensive weapons and vehicles. As a result, Ukraine must brace itself for a huge operation. The major goal of this operation was to drive Russian forces out of Ukrainian territory. On the other hand, the Russian army began to show signs of adopting some rather illogical qualities during this period. Russia began to lose all of its previous advantages. Since the start of the war, the Russian army, which has planned numerous operations to dominate specific territory, has suffered growing setbacks. To compensate for these setbacks, Putin attempted to build alliances with a number of countries but was rejected by all of them. Putin is also enraged at Japan for its backing of Ukraine. Japan's determined action has substantially complicated matters. It is common knowledge that Japan plays a crucial role among the G7 countries, particularly in view of the massive number of tanks that the Ukrainian army has been purchasing for some time. It was surprising that Putin's earlier destabilizing acts had such an impact on the G7. Putin's frequent threats to deploy nuclear weapons against the entire world elicited responses from a diverse range of countries. Japan was one of the most advanced of these countries. Following the G7 meeting, it was evident that many embargoes would be put on Russia, while Ukraine would be given considerable support. Initially, Japan offered one of the largest relief donations. Japan has donated about $550 million in aid to Ukraine since the crisis began. However, due to the recent elections, the total sum of the aid was decreased to approximately $5.5 billion. This sum will provide Ukraine with the funds it requires to end the conflict. But then Japan made a decision that startled the entire globe, especially when it came to tanks. Although Japan has agreed to deploy 50 Japanese-made Mitsubishi tanks, things have changed dramatically for the Ukrainian armed forces. Surprisingly, Ukraine has coordinated an operation with newly obtained troops and tanks. Initially, the Ukrainian army sent a considerable number of tanks in the direction of Zaporizhia. Thank you for gathering basic information from the Barak doors. The presence of Russian army T-90s in the vicinity was well known. So they did what they had to do. They teamed up with Mitsubishi's American Abrams and German Leopard 2s to deliver a crushing blow to Russia's army. The Ukrainian army surrounded Russia with this maneuver. Ukraine's tanks altered positions in order to acquire a significant advantage over Razia. This region did not have nearly as many heavy tanks as the rest of Ukraine. A portion of the Ukrainian army was left behind to undertake a simultaneous frontal and rear attack. However, the Russian army was also mobilized. The T-90 is stationed in Serbia. The Ukrainian army eventually engaged in a square battle in response to Ukraine's recent activities. Following that, it directed its tanks to begin firing on the Russian troops. But then something happened that caught the Russians completely off guard. No matter how many shots the Russian T-90s fired at the Ukrainian tanks, they were unable to pierce their armor. The Ukrainian army's Abrams tanks, on the other hand, were able to kill the T-90s on their own. The Abrams atomic-powered barrel played a significant role in this. Seeing this as imminent, the Russian army began to plan their departure. Some Russian soldiers withdrew, but the remaining Russian tanks and this sector of the Ukrainian army were finally forced to surrender. The success of this maneuver was critical to regaining control of the territory for Ukrainian soldiers. Ukraine was well known to be putting pressure on Russia in numerous ways at this juncture, but Putin's decisions emerged as the main factor behind this latest campaign. Despite the setback, Putin's constant threats against Ukraine and the rest of the globe remained. Some of his nuclear weapons are now stationed in Belarus. This action has further exacerbated the situation. It is well documented that Putin attempted to employ the tactic in the belief that it would help him forget the setback, despite universal consensus that it was unnecessary. However, recent international press reports indicate that the Ukrainian military is debating the prospect of choosing an entirely different course of action. These newfound advantages are thought to be a game changer for Ukraine. Ukrainian troops will now be in a better position to cause harm to Russia's army. The full scope of the war's consequences will be revealed at that point, but pronouncements by military experts have muddied the subject. According to military analysts, Ukraine has been putting tremendous pressure on Russia for some time. Ukraine is under increasing pressure to evict Russians from its borders. This operation, if successful, will demonstrate that Ukraine is formulating a strong counteroffensive strategy. And now the preparations are at a point where they have the potential to drastically alter the outcome of the war. The Russian army is now at risk of being surrounded. Ukraine is capitalizing on its advantages, which is an important aspect. Putin is attempting to get out of this jam by approaching other countries, such as China. However, he is aggravated by the negative comments he is receiving. The Russian military's future has grown increasingly dependent on Vladimir Putin's decisions. Men, too. However, because of his deep convictions regarding the invasion of Ukraine, the activities of the Ukrainian army have provided this man with cover to evade accountability in a number of other areas. The Russian army is currently in its first hour of service. Putin's popularity is dwindling by the day. As a result of this ongoing settlement, Putin is finding it difficult to take action. However, Putin has been granted the opportunity to command military activities in the region. But, fearing criticism, Putin squandered the opportunity. The Russian military directed Putin to assume the role of supreme leader and commander-in-chief. However, Putin's continued silence on the problem has exacerbated matters from the perspective of Russia's armed forces. This was a critical issue. The situation became increasingly difficult as the Russians prepared to make big changes in the region. Some sections of the Russian military began to suspect this. During the operations, it became evident that the majority of Russian military endeavors had failed, and Putin himself did not accept this fact. These studies led to the possibility of massive uprisings inside Russia's armed forces. Putin, fully aware of the situation, began delegating harsh training tactics to Russian military leaders. The Russian military, which has already been through a lot, will now face much more difficulties. Some have speculated that this could lead to Russian soldiers willingly surrendering to the Ukrainian authorities. If this occurs, Putin will soon be left with no troops to fight with him in Ukraine. This would be the first step towards changing the tide of the war in Ukraine's favor. Putin's forces will be ejected soon now that Ukraine has acquired command of Russia's armed forces in the region. And if that happens, Putin will almost certainly go. Russia watched the flames rekindle during the night. The roof of a towering building in the Belgorod region caught fire. During the night, a big fire broke out near the Ukrainian-Russian border. The fire is said to have started in the building of the Ministry of Emergency Situations in Belgorod, where the Legion of Freedom of Russia had been carrying out operations up to this point. We'll update you in our next video once the details of the fire have been established. You can subscribe to avoid missing our future videos. Images of Russian volunteer forces working at Novaya Tavoljhanka, near Belgorod Oblast, were shared in films posted yesterday. The cause of the flames is unknown at this time. What are your thoughts on this matter? You can specify it in the comments section. Also in the same area, a Ukrainian kamikaze unmanned aerial vehicle targeted Russian communication and surveillance stations, according to photographs released yesterday. Russian propagandists began to terrify Belarusians by speaking on Russian television. He intended to conduct a ludicrous look at Stuart's toys, Granny's toys, and Stoy's toys. Or was Peter Nazi shy? Are you aware of this? Just don't chase, squabble, or try to score. You saw NICU and TAM over them. Russian propaganda is now aggressively supporting the idea that Poland and Ukraine pose a threat to Belarus. This is how the Kremlin explains Belarus's nuclear weapons deployment. With the update last night, Ukraine liberated 2 more territories from occupation. According to the Deep State map, Ukrainian armed forces men fought Russians north of Urazane and near Novodonetska. The Ukrainian military is moving closer to Berdyansk. A Russian propagandist, speaking on TV, said something fascinating yet again. He claimed that we caused the war because we didn't want to be involved in one. And he went on to say that was the end of Hillary. They can't blow anyone up with Kakim, Raskesa, and me down here. Mini had him by name, but I need out on us a stomach while you're below. Glomny Tako's sassy neck 9, UD Saker. According to Andrei Fedorov, a former Russian deputy foreign minister, the Ukrainian army is preparing for the second stage of the operation and is attempting to forecast the course of events. I was just Providian at the peak, most likely in Ukraine's ski W-type meet after 50 so stinger of shop preserves. The Nicello narrative by Cyril must so meteorists, Father Sir was very hazy. Yesterday, Ukrainian President Zelensky welcomed a delegation of African leaders led by South African President Cyril Ramaphosa to Kyiv. Whoever sent statements to the world at the end of the discussions emphasized that the situation in Ukraine is a war, not a crisis. Creature. Palmer has been here for 9 months. It's merely to demonstrate to the Beauty Academy, which is a leader in shoulder shop, the key to doing this. Enough to abort something you didn't do at the club, and this is a shot you didn't do at the club, not because it was the idea to. Nafsa is my best pony. Mochima, she should be whiter than me. They can force every subsequent producer to be crazier than he already is. It's an improvement. It's a rule that there's nothing here for people to keep this madness going. We will continue to discuss and add details about this event as they become available. You can stay up to date on the newest news. The military forces of Ukraine claim that as Kiev's battalions launch a long-awaited module attack with the assistance of contemporary NATO weapons technology, such as main battle tanks, Russian troops are rapidly losing control of occupied territories. This week marked the start of Kiev's long-planned operation. Russian forces report an increase in fighting and aggressive actions by motorized columns at various sites along the 800-mile front line. This comprises the area near Donetsk's Bakhmut city and the southern contact line in Zaporizhia Oblast. On Thursday, Hanna Maliar, deputy Ukrainian defense minister, warned on Telegram that Russian influence over seized regions is waning. Moscow's forces have used harsher techniques to control the local populace. Melia said that the power of Russian occupation authorities in Ukraine's temporarily occupied region is rapidly dwindling owing to their inability to maintain adequate living conditions for the local populace. Russian troops have been preparing for a counterattack from Ukraine in the partially seized Ukrainian areas of Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia for months. Moscow's soldiers have also had to deal with deep strikes behind enemy lines, partisan sabotage operations, and Ukrainian Special Forces activities. Miller stated that the position of the occupiers is becoming more difficult as Ukraine shifts to offensive operations. She noted that Moscow's soldiers are taking harder measures to root out concealed opponents, particularly last week. Miller claimed that Russian troops besieged the village of Kurylivka in the temporarily seized territory of the Zaporizhia region for many days, during which time they conducted a comprehensive filtration of the local population as well as raids on local infrastructure facilities and the residences of people. According to Miller, representatives of Russia's FSB Federal Security Service investigated particularly extensively the residents who were known to have pro-Ukrainian views. These checks included those based on denunciations, and some of the citizens who were found to have pro-Ukrainian beliefs were taken away for additional interrogation. Have not returned. Officials from Russia have expressed optimism over Ukraine's unfolding offensive up to this point. They claim that their forces have been successful in stopping many armored Ukrainian drives while inflicting substantial losses on the invaders. However, given Moscow's long history of obfuscation and deceit, very little trust can be placed in its military reports. In the meantime, Ukraine is mostly keeping operational silence on the new onslaught. Earlier in the week, Melior stated that there would be no statement at the beginning of the push. Melior did add that Ukrainian forces in numerous regions had turned over to offensive operations on Friday, reporting significant Russian attacks in the Donetsk region, which Melior claimed remains the focus of the battle and Ukrainian activities in Zaporizhia. However, Melior did add that Ukrainian units in other regions had shifted over to offensive operations on Friday. Melior stated in his writing that war is never without casualties. Emerging reports from Russian military bloggers and U.S. sources have provided details about severe deaths among the attacking Ukrainian forces that came into contact with the first line of Russian defenders. Alexander Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, stated on Friday that the West ought to look at Russia's invasion of Ukraine as a gift to be given to them. Lukashenko has been one of Russian President Vladimir Putin's most trusted allies throughout the Russia-Ukraine war that began in February of last year. Putin recently attempted to procure additional members for the small Union State alliance by saying that any nation that joins the cause will be provided with nuclear weapons. Recently, Lukashenko attempted to procure additional members for the small Union State alliance by saying that he would provide nuclear weapons to any nation that joined the cause. In addition to this, Belarus will soon become the first country since the collapse of the Soviet Union to host Russian nuclear warheads. As soon as Russia sent its military into Ukraine, Western nations, particularly those that are members of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, rapidly rallied together in response. Because of this, numerous sanctions have been imposed against Moscow, and there has been a renewed phase of steadfast international support for Ukraine. As a result, President Joe Biden was prompted to declare in Poland at the end of February that NATO is stronger than it has ever been. Let's face it. According to a report from a Ukrainian news outlet called Ukrainska Pravda, President Lukashenko of Belarus said the following during a meeting with the leaders of the Security Councils of the Collective Security Treaty Organization: "We gave them a gift when we got bogged down in Ukraine. This is, of course, a gift to them. Nevertheless, here they have begun clutching to it in an effort to bring our space to its knees." During the discussion, the president of Belarus noted that Russia is not the primary object of attention for the West, but rather China is. Artem Shraidman, a Belarusian political analyst and the founder of the Sense Analytics consultancy, told Newsweek via Telegram on Friday that he believes Lukashenko's reference to the gift is an acknowledgement that the unity of Western forces has caused Russia and Belarus to spend a significant amount of resources on the war. Artem Shraidman is a political analyst in Belarus. According to what Shraidman said, in his perspective, it's simply the West finding a method to help Russia fail without actively confronting it in any capacity. When asked why Lukashenko could not have anticipated the West firmly rising up in reprisal to Putin's invasion, Shraidman noted that the Belarusian president was probably already too hooked to Putin's hip to be able to make any other decision but to fight beside him. Lukashenko was asked why he could not have anticipated the West strongly standing up in retaliation to Putin's invasion. Due to the fact that Lukashenko has a history of making claims with the intention of manipulating others, Mikhail Troitsky, a professor of practice at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, told Newsweek on Friday that Lukashenko's assertions should be taken with a grain of salt. Troitsky made his comments via email. Troitsky added that his argument was rather that before launching the war, Russia and Belarus, and personally Putin and Lukashenko as mediators, exhausted all diplomatic measures to protect their own security in the face of the Western onslaught on China via Belarus, Russia, and Eurasia. This was mentioned in reference to Troitsky's statement. Lukashenko, it should be noted, attributes the full-scale invasion of Ukraine to the unyielding stances taken by Ukraine and the West since 2014. He emphasizes that Lukashenko was complicit in Ukraine's deceit when it signed the Minsk agreements that he was supposed to have helped negotiate. According to Lukashenko, the fact that Russia got bogged down in Ukraine is only one problem that the West hastened to exploit cruelly. This statement occurred just a day before the world's media became submerged in the catastrophic aftermath of the explosion of the Kakhovka Dam in Russian-controlled Ukraine. In Guinea, you have a situation in which the media is focusing on the tragic aftermath of the explosion of the Kakhovka Dam. On June 5, Prigozhin unleashed his most recent tirade against the Russian army, yet it went completely unnoticed. It was his most detonating performance to date. Prigozhin, the commander of an army of contract fighters known as the Wagner Group, accuses the Russian army of lying about events in the Belgorod region, which is where anti-Putin Russian partisans have been conducting cross-border raids from Ukraine since the end of May, and warns of the possibility of civil war while dressed in khaki sweatpants and a khaki sweatshirt in the middle of a forest in a Wagner training camp. He demands that the Russian defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, be placed on trial for assisting the genocide of the Russian population by being completely unprepared for the war in Ukraine, and he says more than once that Shoigu and other high military commanders should be executed. The genocide of the Russian population was made possible because Shoigu was unprepared for the war in Ukraine. In addition to this, Prigozhin asserts that residents of the Belgorod region have been sending him letters in which they propose a remedy including Chile. Prigozhin, a member of the Russian elite, is speaking in a stadium that is ringed by armed men with machine guns. He argues that Chile is synonymous with Pinochet. Even at this early stage, Prigozhin plays the nuclear card, arguing that the use of nuclear weapons at this time would be counterproductive and that the button should have been hit earlier, despite the fact that doing so would have been the act of a psychopath. In a later part of the interview, he speculates that the Russians have the capability of employing a nuclear weapon on Russian soil. This is accompanied by the reassuring proviso that he is uncertain as to how well nuclear weapons would function if they were maintained in the same manner as the rest of Russia's hardware. The 2.5-hour-long interview follows Prigozhin's tour of Russian cities, during which he spoke of the necessity to open the second front in the information sphere in order to tell the population the truth about what is happening on the front lines. He also recommended the creation of a territorial army specifically to protect Russia, despite the fact that he denies having any political ambitions. The interview was conducted after Prigozhin's tour of Russian cities. When taken together, all of these aspects give the impression that a politician is getting ready for either a political campaign or a military takeover. Unanswered is the question of whether or not Prigozhin is under the jurisdiction of the Kremlin. Or does a rogue element pose a significant risk to the current government? Due to the fact that nothing in Russia is ever how it appears, this inquiry is most likely much too straightforward. However, it seems that certain things are more obvious than others. If Prigozhin did not have support and security from the highest levels of government, he would not be able to travel around Russia holding court. In addition to this, Russia's most well-known anti-corruption activist, Alexei Navalny, is vilifying those whom he refers to as corrupt elites and calling with complete impunity for them to be executed. Is wasting away in a penitentiary colony and is looking at the possibility of serving a sentence of 30 years in prison. Those who have protection in the appropriate areas are able to speak their minds regardless of the consequences. After successfully conquering Bakhmut, Prigozhin made the decision to evacuate his soldiers. Therefore, the regular Russian army was left to defend the city. Was he allowed to do this despite the fact that Russia's grip on Bakhmut was threatened by the Ukrainian military forces, who have recovered control of parts of the countryside in the area around Bakhmut? If the Russians are unable to hold on to the city in the next few weeks, the blame will be placed on the regular army. And Prigozhin's victory over Bakhmut will be unblemished once more. This indicates that patronage was given at the highest level, which enables him to preserve his face by advocating the establishment of a territorial defense and launching what he refers to as his second Wagner front. On the home front, it would appear that Prigozhin is preparing himself to take on a variety of policing, security, and intelligence gathering and dissemination responsibilities within Russia. This is a significant departure from serving as a weapon for proxy foreign policy and maintaining a private army that operates overseas. It is difficult to fathom how long this objective will continue to be met without opposition, particularly when one takes into consideration the fact that Wagner, along with the vast majority of other private military businesses that are not designed to guard essential infrastructure, are still considered to be formally unlawful. Another factor that is becoming more obvious is the likelihood of interethnic strife, anarchy, and hostility, if not outright military confrontation. During the past week, Wagner forces detained an officer of the Russian Federal Army whom they accused of mining their retreat and shooting at them, while drunk anti-Putin Russian partisans captured Russian regular forces and invited the governor of the Belgorod region to negotiate their freedom, and a high-ranking Chechen fighter openly criticized you for highlighting the rivalry between the Chechen forces and Wagner without counting the mounting jealousies among the Chechen fighters. Include one who is fighting on the Ukrainian side in the struggle with one another. If it is accepted that Prigozhin is being protected by the Kremlin, then the question becomes, to what extent does Putin represent the Kremlin? Prigozhin has, until this point, abstained from making any direct assaults on the president and has even gone so far as to say that he respects the president. However, it would appear that Putin is weakening the whole concept of Russia's nuclear deterrent by making light of Russia's nuclear decision-making and capabilities in his most recent harangue. It is difficult to read this as anything other than a critique of Putin, who is the ultimate authority on the deployment of nuclear weapons. The most recent outburst from double-triple bluff Prigozhin appears to be more and more like the tip of an iceberg, which shows developing fractures inside of Russia's top power structure in a country that cannot even defend a little sliver of its border from intrusions and allows drones to reach the center of power. It is difficult to think that there is a master in the Kremlin who possesses the absolute control, foresight, and planning capacity required to manage all of this turmoil and pull the strings of Prigozhin's puppet show. Senior members of Russia's Security Council cowered in servitude in front of what appeared to be an all-powerful Vladimir Putin in February 2022, just 2 days before Russia invaded Ukraine. These same men, as the war grinds on, may be the ones scheming to take leadership from a president who seems increasingly removed from the realities of the battlefield. This might happen as the conflict drags on. They will want a scapegoat in order to deflect blame away from the unsuccessful special military mission. Because of Prigozhin's consistent attacks against the regular army, the leadership of the Russian armed forces is effectively being served to them on a silver platter. It's possible that he is also promising to be their front man and a guarantor of immunity while he assists them in navigating the pandemonium that is about to ensue. It is anyone's guess as to whether or not this involves Vladimir Putin. The lofty goals that Russian President Vladimir Putin has set for demilitarizing Ukraine might call for some course corrections. After more than a year of difficult struggle that has achieved few of the Kremlin's initial goals, the head of the Moscow-installed occupation authority in Crimea has stated that few of those goals have been realized. According to statements made by Sergei Aksionov, who was named leader of occupied Crimea after its annexation by Moscow's tiny green men in 2014, the quickly changing situation at the front in southern and eastern Ukraine will compel any re-evaluation of Russian war goals. These statements were made to the television channel Crimea 24, and they were made by Aksionov. According to Aksionov, the circumstances evolve on a daily basis. According to a recent article from the Moscow Times, in spite of this, I believe that we will eventually achieve our aims in some form or another. He continued by saying, "In my own mind, there is no question." Putin began his invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 with the intention of denuclearizing and demilitarizing Ukraine. These hazy ambitions were constructed on an unreliable foundation consisting of historical revisionism and, according to reports, years' worth of deceptive briefings from the military hierarchy and Russia's security services. Despite several warnings from U.S. intelligence agencies that Vladimir Putin had made preparations for a full-scale war, few people thought the Kremlin was brave or foolish enough to undertake a drive for Kyiv. This was despite the fact that many analysts feared a Russian onslaught to finish the partial occupation of the eastern Donbass region. In less than a month, Moscow's war plans were in shambles. Successive military failures followed, and now Ukraine's long-planned counteroffensive poses a threat to push the Kremlin into another embarrassing retreat in the south or east of the nation. Putin has asserted that Russia has annexed 4 regions of Ukraine that are currently being partially occupied: Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Luhansk. Russian soldiers are currently able to control approximately 20% of Ukraine's internationally recognized territory. Over the course of the past few months, a total of 4 Russian forces have spent that time developing defenses for an anticipated counterattack by the Ukrainians in Donetsk. It is said that Russian troops commanded by mercenaries from the Wagner Group suffered astonishing casualties in the process of seizing control of the damaged city of Bakhmut. In the meantime, Ukraine has been preparing for its forthcoming offensive by integrating weapon systems from NATO and training new soldiers. On the political front, the war started by Moscow has given Kyiv a significant boost in its long-held goals of joining NATO and the European Union. If what Vladimir Putin wanted was to stop Ukraine from moving politically and culturally toward the West over the course of several decades, he has been spectacularly unsuccessful. The Ukrainian capital of Kyiv has likewise not been coy about its desire to free Crimea. The annexation of which kicked off a new, heated chapter in a conflict that had been going on between Moscow and other important players since at least the turn of the century. Although some Western officials have urged Ukrainian leaders to temper their ambitions, President Volodymyr Zelensky and his top officials have stated that there can be no end to the war as long as Crimea remains under Russian control. Aksenov told Crimea 24 that the Kremlin's failure to implement its original goals could potentially create a more difficult strategic situation in the future. According to Aksenov, the presence of a militaristic Ukraine within NATO and the EU will make it even more challenging for us to make any sort of statement. Put something together. When onlookers asked Aksenov where the final border between Russia and Ukraine would be defined, he encouraged them to have patience. The United States Department of Defense has stated that they will be providing Ukraine with a new security assistance package under the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative USAI, which will have a maximum value of $2.1 billion. According to the statement that was put up on the website of the United States Department of Defense, this package, which has a potential value of up to $2.1 billion and consists of essential air defense and ammunition capabilities, is being delivered as part of the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative. As was mentioned, the package includes supplementary ammunition for air defense systems such as Patriot and Hawk, as well as artillery rounds of 105 mm and 203 mm in diameter for missiles. Puma unmanned aerial systems, a laser-guided rocket system, and munition support for training, maintenance, and sustainment tasks are all things that this company provides. According to the statement, this USAI package exemplifies the sustained commitment to both Ukraine's crucial near-term capabilities as well as the enduring capacity of Ukraine's armed forces to defend its territory and deter Russian invasion over the long term. In other words, the package shows that the United States remains committed to both of these things. This information was provided by a Polish specialist, General Waldemar Skrzypczak, a former commander of the Polish army, in an interview with a Ukrainian publication. According to what Skrzypczak mentioned, in 2 or 3 months, Ukraine will have F-16 aircraft because Ukrainian pilots are without a doubt ready to operate them. In my perspective, this prediction is accurate. As pilot training on this type of aircraft is a lengthy process, he believes that the Ukraine is almost at the point where its pilots are prepared to operate F-16s in battle. He emphasized this opinion by stating that the training of Ukrainian pilots on F-16s has been going on for a long time. Therefore, all that remains to be decided at this point is which nations will be the suppliers of the aircraft. According to the broad consensus, the United States is capable of producing F-16s, and F-18s, which have also been brought up in recent conversations, are also extremely good in their operational capacity. Skripchek is of the opinion that the Ukraine should not wait for F-16s but instead carry out a counteroffensive operation with the equipment it has already acquired from the West. Skripchek expressed this viewpoint in an interview. The Ukraine has been supplied with MiG-20s and is prepared to deal with the initial stage of the counteroffensive. The general emphasized that the initial strike needed to be made at this moment. Before the NATO summit, something must take place to demonstrate that Ukraine is trustworthy, according to a former commander of the Polish army, who stressed the importance of this point. It is time to demonstrate that the Ukrainian army, which has received major support from the West, is capable of defeating a portion of the Russian army that is currently stationed in Ukraine. This is the line of reasoning that Zelensky uses. When Stoltenberg is in Vilnius on the 11th and 12th of July, the President of Ukraine edition needs to be placed on the table in front of him. According to what Skripchek indicated, it is really significant that the people of Ukraine are also waiting for this. The NATO meeting in Vilnius will take place on the 11th and 12th of July, as previously reported.